likely to arrive by boat as she was to drop out of the sky in a helicopter. But however she arrived, she could always be sure of a warm welcome. Wherever there was need or suffering, she could be relied upon to do something about it. Her name is Eva Den Hartog, trained nurse and midwife, Salvation Army officer. What made her leave Holland and take up this lifetime of caring for the sick and needy in faraway places? At an early age, Eva was placed in a Salvation Army children's home because her mother's marriage had broken down and she couldn't care for her family. She is the baby on the right in the group. Her brother Wim was there too. Eva grew up in the home, and she never forgot the love and care she received there. When she was 5, she was able to return home. Her mother had remarried, and for several years, Eva enjoyed a happy home life. But war came to Europe. In 1940, the Nazi army invaded Holland. Hitler's planes attacked Rotterdam. Mercilessly, they pounded the city into rubble. Faced with the complete destruction of the country, the Dutch surrendered. During the occupation, at the age of 19, Eva joined the Salvation Army. It was her ambition to be an officer and a nurse, and to go out into the mission field. The end of the war brought her hopes one stage nearer. She was accepted for the Salvation Army Officers Training College in Paris. Her stay in France gave her a grasp of the language. This was to open the door to a lifetime of service in disaster-stricken parts of the world. It was 10 years before Eva became a trained nurse. At last, in 1958, the call came. There was a need for French-speaking nurses in the Belgian Congo, and international headquarters in London sent her there. An exhilarated First Lieutenant Eva Den Hartog found Africa fascinating. The winds of change had not yet blown the colonial world away. Leopoldville, the capital, was full of fine buildings. They spoke of Belgium's go-ahead efficiency. Huge factories made a great variety of goods. The Congo, with its vast natural resources, was one of the richest countries in the world. The thousands of workers created a rush hour at the end of the day. She found a thriving Salvation Army here. It had been founded by the legendary Colonel and Mrs. Henri Becquet from Belgium. So many people came to Sunday services in Leopoldville that many couldn't get in. They followed the service through the open windows. Eva was fascinated by Africa. She was sent out into the villages to take part in the Salvation Army's medical work. Baby clinics are one of the most rewarding features of mission work everywhere. Soon, Eva had her own means of transport, and she dashed from clinic to clinic. At last, she was living the life that she had dreamed of for so long. She decided that here she could do worthwhile work and be happy at the same time. But then it happened. A rebellion broke out. Agitators had been urging the people to rise up and throw off the colonial government. The Belgian government panicked and granted freedom to the Congolese immediately. Independence was celebrated.
President-to-be Joseph Kasavubu, a leader in the independence movement, and ill-starred Patrice Lumumba, the most violent agitator for the colony's freedom, were the heroes of the occasion. The people celebrated the birth of a new nation, their Republic of the Congo. But their joy was short-lived. Ancient tribal enmities erupted in the jungles and spread to the cities. Trained public administrators were lacking, and order went by the boards.
Eva found herself involved. As casualties began to pour in, she was called upon to help nurse them. And the Salvation Army clinics had to go on. But there was now an antagonism towards white people, bringing a sinister atmosphere that intensified as night fell. No longer was Africa enchanting. It was full of foreboding. The climax? Savage attacks on whites.
Arriving at Leopoldville in American transport planes, survivors of the Stanleyville massacre. More than 1,000 of them had been held as hostages in the rebel stronghold with dwindling hope of rescue by troops of the Congolese government. Soshambe, Congolese Prime Minister, had confidently announced their imminent release only shortly before terror struck, but too late to save them all. This was the aftermath of the slaughter in Stanleyville.
Eva was one of the Salvation Army nurses called in to tend the wounded. She was appalled by the savage mutilation suffered by the victims. After this, Eva admitted that she found staying overnight in dispensaries in the bush frightening. She was given a vehicle so that she could return to the comparative safety of Leopoldville before dark each day. In this way, she finished her tour of duty in the Congo. So much of her work was with babies that at the end of her tour, she applied to go on a midwifery course. She was sent to the Mothers' Hospital in Clapton, London, established by the Salvation Army at the turn of the century to cater for young unmarried mothers from the slums of London's East End. Her training also taught her English, which would open up other parts of the world tour. In 1971, a crisis developed in East Pakistan. Little did Eva imagine she would become involved. A disastrous tidal wave swept in from the Bay of Bengal and engulfed 500,000 people. 270,000 corpses were said to have been recovered. Panic-stricken people fled from the area. But in those days, East Pakistan was ruled from 1,000 miles away by West Pakistan, who did nothing to help the victims. East Pakistan demanded independence, and war broke out, adding one horror to another. The panic-stricken exodus swelled into a flood of human misery as tens of thousands crossed the border into India and poured into the already overcrowded refugee camps. And who is organizing the food handout to the starving homeless? Eva once again. Salvation Army headquarters had chosen her to take charge of the urgent relief work. But food was only one of the needs. The greatest was a hospital. All she had was an empty building, 60,000 people and no water or lavatories. Yet most of them were suffering from dysentery. A man who is so hungry that he is crying must be desperate indeed. This child is past the point at which it can be saved. Giving it food only prolongs its suffering. Eva thought,
why don't we face facts and give them an extra dose of morphine and put them out of their misery? But it goes against the grain. I'm a Christian. Miracles can happen, and we must help them, even if it seems hopeless.
After a whole year in the camps of Calcutta, Eva was thankful to be home in Holland again. It was wonderful to be away from all the heart-rending scenes and the squalor, to have fresh water and appetizing food. But already, round the other side of the world, another tragedy was about to involve her. The Vietnam War was still continuing. A truce had been agreed between the North and the South. But what would happen when the Americans withdrew? There were hundreds of thousands of refugees. 6 million people were homeless. Eva was seconded by the International Red Cross to train Vietnamese nurses to carry on when they and the Americans had gone. Eva and her team were to be there only 3 months. They were sent to work in a camp housing 9,000 homeless, only a few miles from the Cambodian border. They were close to military activities. Sadly, the truce was not kept when the Americans left. Her work was hampered by the language barrier and the Vietnamese nurses' total lack of knowledge of hygiene. Eva called it Operation Impossible. Returning home, she wrote in her diary,
I seem to belong less and less to Holland, and I feel more at home now in the missionary countries.
This was just as well, because Bangladesh was about to call her again. For 50 days it had rained, 5 inches a day. The Ganges and the Brahmaputra overflowed their banks. 30 million people were affected. By the time that Eva and her team got there, the all-too-familiar scenes had been recreated. A vast shantytown of huts made out of anything that the people could lay their hands on. 15,000 people lived here. Their sole water supply, 2 or 3 pumps like this. The water polluted due to the lack of latrines. To understand the tragedy, it helps to know some of the individual stories. This family was quite well off. They lived in the Faridpur district.